So if we can step back into another sort of beautiful world, which is the actual mechanics, the dirty mess of it, of the human brain, is there something for people who might not know? Is there something you can comment on or describe the key parts of the brain that are important for intelligence, or just in general? What are the different parts of the brain that you're curious about, that you've studied, and that are just good to know about when you're thinking about cognition?
Well, my area of expertise, if I have one, is prefrontal cortex. So,
what's that? Or do we?
It depends on who you ask. The technical definition is anatomical. There are parts of your brain that are responsible for motor behavior, and they're very easy to identify. And the region of your cerebral cortex, the sort of outer crust of your brain that lies in front of those, is defined as the prefrontal cortex.
And when you say anatomical, sorry to interrupt, so that's referring to sort of the geographic region, as opposed to some kind of functional definition.
Exactly. So this is kind of the coward's way out. I'm telling you what the prefrontal cortex is, just in terms of like what part of the real estate it occupies.
It's the thing in the front of the brain.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, the early history of of neuroscientific investigation of what this like front part of the brain does is sort of funny to read, because it was really World War I that started people down this road of trying to figure out what different parts of the brain, the human brain, do, in the sense that there were a lot of people with brain damage who came back from the war with brain damage. And that provided, as tragic as that was, it provided an opportunity for scientists to try to identify the functions of different brain regions. And that was actually incredibly productive. But one of the frustrations that neuropsychologists faced was they couldn't really identify exactly what the deficit was that arose from damage to these most kind of frontal parts of the brain. It was just a very difficult thing to pin down. There were a couple of neuropsychologists who identified through a large amount of clinical experience and close observation, they started to put their finger on a syndrome that was associated with frontal damage. Actually, one of them was a Russian neuropsychologist named Luria, who students of cognitive psychology still read. And what he started to figure out was that the frontal cortex was somehow involved in flexibility, in guiding behaviors that required someone to override a habit, or to do something unusual, or to change what they were doing in a very flexible way from one moment to another.
So focused on like new experiences. And so the way your brain processes and acts in new experiences.
Yeah. What later helped bring this function into better focus was a distinction between controlled and automatic behavior, or to in other literatures, this is referred to as habitual behavior versus goal-directed behavior. So it's very, very clear that the human brain has pathways that are dedicated to habits, to things that you do all the time, and they need to be automatized so that they don't require you to concentrate too much, so that leaves your cognitive capacity free to do other things. Just think about the difference between driving when you're learning to drive versus driving after you're fairly expert. There are brain pathways that slowly absorb those frequently performed behaviors so that they can be habits, so that they can be automatic.
So that's kind of like the purest form of learning, I guess, is happening there, which is why, I mean, this is kind of jumping ahead, which is why that perhaps is the most useful for us to focusing on and trying to see how artificial intelligence systems can learn. Is that the way?
It's interesting. I do think about this distinction between controlled and automatic, or goal-directed and habitual behavior a lot. in thinking about where we are in AI research. But just to finish the kind of dissertation here, the role of the prefrontal cortex is generally understood these days sort of in contradistinction to that habitual domain. In other words, the prefrontal cortex is what helps you override those habits. It's what allows you to say, whoa, what I usually do in this situation is X, but given the context, I probably should do Y. I mean, the elbow bump is a great example, right? Mm-hmm. If reaching out and shaking hands is probably a habitual behavior, and it's the prefrontal cortex that allows us to bear in mind that there's something unusual going on right now, and in this situation, I need to not do the usual thing. The kind of behaviors that Luria reported, and he built tests for detecting these kinds of things, were exactly like this. So in other words, when I stick out my hand, I want you instead to present your elbow. A patient with frontal damage would have a great deal of trouble with that. Somebody proffering their hand would elicit a handshake. The prefrontal cortex is what allows us to say, hold on, that's the usual thing, but I have the ability to bear in mind even very unusual contexts and to reason about what behavior is appropriate there.
Just to get a sense, are us humans special in the presence of the prefrontal cortex? Do mice have a prefrontal cortex? Do other mammals that we can study? If no, then how do they integrate new experiences?
Yeah, that's a really tricky question and a very timely question, because we have revolutionary new technologies for monitoring, measuring, and also causally influencing neural behavior in mice and fruit flies. And these techniques are not fully available even for studying brain function in monkeys, let alone humans. And so it's a very sort of, for me at least, a very urgent question whether the kinds of things that we want to understand about human intelligence can be pursued in these other organisms. And to put it briefly, there's disagreement. People who study fruit flies will often tell you, hey, fruit flies are smarter than you think. And they'll point to experiments where fruit flies were able to learn new behaviors, were able to generalize from one stimulus to another in a way that suggests that they have abstractions that guide their generalization. I've had many conversations in which I will start by observing, recounting some observation about mouse behavior, where it seemed like mice were taking an awfully long time to learn a task that for a human would be profoundly trivial. And I will conclude from that mice really don't have the cognitive flexibility that we want to explain. And then a mouse researcher will say to me, well, hold on. That experiment may not have worked because you asked a mouse to deal with stimuli and behaviors that were very unnatural for the mouse. If instead you kept the logic of the experiment the same, but presented the information in a way that aligns with what mice are used to dealing with in their natural habitats, you might find that a mouse actually has more intelligence than you think. And then they'll go on to show you videos of mice doing things in their natural habitat, which seem strikingly intelligent, dealing with, physical problems. I have to drag this piece of food back to my lair, but there's something in my way. And how do I get rid of that thing? So I think these are open questions, to put it, to sum that up.
And then taking a small step back, so related to that, is you kind of mentioned we're taking a little shortcut by saying it's a geographic part of the prefrontal cortex is a region of the brain. But if we, what's your sense in a bigger philosophical view, prefrontal cortex and the brain in general, do you have a sense that it's a set of subsystems in the way we've kind of implied that are pretty distinct? Or to what degree is it that, or to what degree is it a giant interconnected mess where everything kind of does everything and it's impossible to disentangle them?
Mm-hmm. I think there's overwhelming evidence that there's functional differentiation, that it's clearly not the case that all parts of the brain are doing the same thing. This follows immediately from the kinds of studies of brain damage that we were chatting about before. It's obvious from what you see if you stick an electrode in the brain and measure what's going on at the level of neural activity. Having said that, there are two other things to add, which kind of, I don't know, maybe tug in the other direction. One is that it's when you look carefully at functional differentiation in the brain, what you usually end up concluding, at least this is my observation of the literature, is that the differences between regions are graded rather than being discrete. So it doesn't seem like it's easy to divide the brain up into true modules where that are that have clear boundaries and that have clear channels of communication between them.
Instead, and this applies to the prefrontal cortex?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. The prefrontal cortex is made up of a bunch of different subregions. The functions of which are not clearly defined, and which the borders of which seem to be quite vague. And then there's another thing that's popping up in very recent research, which involves application of these new techniques. Which there are a number of studies that suggest that parts of the brain that we would have previously thought were quite focused in their function are actually carrying signals that we wouldn't have thought would be there. For example, looking in the primary visual cortex, which is classically thought of as basically the first cortical way station for processing visual information. Basically, what it should care about is, where are the edges in this scene that I'm viewing? It turns out that if you have enough data, you can recover information from primary visual cortex about all sorts of things, like what behavior the animal is engaged in right now, and how much reward is on offer in the task that it's pursuing. So it's clear that even regions whose function is pretty well defined at a coarse grain are nonetheless carrying some information about information from very different domains. So, the history of neuroscience is sort of this oscillation between the two views that you articulated, the kind of modular view and then the big, mush view. And, I think, I guess we're going to end up somewhere in the middle, which is unfortunate for our understanding, because there's something about our, conceptual system that finds it easy to think about a modularized system and easy to think about a completely undifferentiated system. But something that kind of lies in between is confusing, but we're going to have to get used to it, I think.